With the Acura Integra Type S now unveiled, it got me thinking, if I were in the market for one of these cars, a sporty Japanese manual hatchback, which one would I pick? Would I pick the Honda Civic Type R, or would I go for the Acura Integra Type S? So in this video, I'm gonna explain which one I would personally buy between these two. But first of all, before we jump into the design, have a look at the front, side, and rear and the interior. Let's have a look at this article from The Drive. I'm gonna link this down in the description, just for some of the spec and tech of these two cars and what's different between them when it comes to the tech. So let's get the obvious out of the way. The Integra Type S looks different from the Civic Type R inside and out. I know, we're gonna talk more about that in just a second. The Integra Type S officially makes 5 more horsepower. That's a total of 5 extra horsepower than the Civic Type R. So you have 320 over 315. However, the Acura weighs a little bit more. So during a race, they will probably be very, very close when it comes to 0 to 60 times and so on. And they both use the same 6-speed manual transmission. Manual only for these two cars. You can't even get them in automatic. I think that's a fantastic choice by both Honda and Acura to put that in, because otherwise, like when I was driving the M2 recently, if there was only a manual option, I wouldn't even consider anything else because there's nothing else to consider. But then you have that beautiful transmission in the M2, which made it really difficult to decide whether to go with a manual or automatic. But in this case, you only have one choice, so there's no problem there. They even wear the same 265/30 R19 Michelin Pilot Sport 4S tires and the 4-piston Brembo front brakes. Very cool. Judging from the Acura setup screen, it appears rev matching and engine noise cannot be configured, which you can do in the Honda. 2 Integra Type S features that don't appear in the Civic Type R: the 5.3-inch head-up display, which I think is a cool addition to this car, and the 16-speaker premium audio system. However, the Acura misses out on the LED shifts light that sits right here above the gauge cluster on the Civic Type R. And the biggest, most significant daily driver differences between these two are probably gonna be the seats. As you know, in the Civic Type R, they're very sporty, looking super cool, but in the Acura, they kind of dial it down a little bit, which kind of suits the Acura in my opinion. Pricing hasn't been unveiled for the Type S yet, but considering that the top premium Integra A spec starts at about $37,500 and the Type R starts at $44,390, we can expect the Integra Type S to probably come in at around $50,000. I hope it's not more than $50,000 for the base Type S, but I guess we're gonna have to wait and see what it actually comes out at. So let's have a look at the designs here, and let's compare the front, side, and rear, and then talk about the interior of these two cars. As I've said before, I think both of these cars are really good looking hatchbacks. They look fantastic, and they still manage to have the same, they're very similar when it comes to the proportions. They're pretty much identical when it comes to proportions. Gonna have a look at that in side view, but they still manage to have two completely different personalities when it comes to the styling of the car, and I think they did a really good job separating these two in this way. You can see that the Acura, for example, feels a lot sharper in its design. Typical Acura design, having its sharp lines, and we have this sharp grille of the Acura as well going in here, and the lower section, the entire bumper, looks more sporty than the Civic Type R. There are a couple of things with the Acura that to me I like it, but it doesn't make sense that they put it on the Acura instead of the Honda Civic Type R. For example, one of those would be this intake in the side. I think this would be more suitable for the Type R, but the Type R in this case feels almost like the more elegant version of these two, which I feel should be maybe switched, because this Type R feels like the wilder, younger sibling to the Acura Integra Type S. And I think intakes like this, it looks great on the Acura, but I think it would look great on the Type R as well, and fit the personality of the Type R. But what I like about the Type R in the front end are all these beautiful small chamfers that we have. Look at this chamfer going around the lower intake, for example. We have another chamfer going above the front end graphics, with this chamfer going right here, looking looking beautiful. Another chamfer going at the lower part of the front end. I love these small chamfers because what chamfers do to me is they tell me that the graphics that's surrounded by the chamfer has a housing. It was intended to be there, and we create a nice framing for the graphics by using these beautiful chamfers. But it still looks a lot smoother and a little bit softer than the Acura, which is totally in line with both of these brands and their design philosophy. So let's have a look at the Integra up top on the side view and the Honda Civic Type R down at the bottom. As I said, I think both of these looks really cool, and this Integra Type S just looks so much better than the normal Integra or the A-Spec. Specifically, another detail that I think would look really cool on the Honda, it feels like they should have applied on the Honda and not on the Acura, but again, I'm glad that they did apply it on the Acura. That is these wide fenders. So we have almost a wide body kit on the Acura, which is insane to put on the Acura because, as I said, it feels like the more grown-up sibling of these two, while this Civic Type R down here is a crazy one. But what I like, they went all in with this wide body kit because look at this door. They had to create a specific door for the Type S, and I love this type of dedication when you add body parts like the wide fenders here. This is a more dedicated wide body than we have on the M3, for example, because if you look at this section, I've talked about that before, on the M3, they squeezed in this tight, the wider fender, rear fender, and then they kept the same door like we have on the normal 3 Series, and it creates a very unique and weird looking crease here in the M3 that, well, once you see it, it's very hard to unsee, but in this case, it looks fantastic. So looking at the line flow of these two cars, what I like about the Acura is this line that we have on pretty much every single Acura going downwards. As I said, these have the same type of proportions. Everything is the same if we look at these cars from a silhouette, except for this big wing that we have on the Type R. But what this line does in comparison to the Honda Civic shoulder line right here is that this makes it feel like the front end sits a little lower, and it makes for a sportier look, in my opinion, having this downward angle going down instead of having it be horizontal like we have in the Civic Type R. This makes it feel like there's less mass in the front end, while this feels like the hood is sitting a little bit higher than it does on the Acura. But that's just a play with graphics. They're actually the same height. However, the length of the Acura is 5.1 inches longer. Doesn't have to do anything with the wheelbase because the wheelbase is exactly the same, but the body parts, for example, this diffuser in the back and this underbite in the front end, adds to a little bit longer length than we have in the Honda Civic down here. Again, the Acura feels a lot more sharper. You have that sharpness here down at the bottom as well. Look at this and compare this to the Honda Civic down here, which has a very smooth line going into this bumper in the rear. Both are beautiful in their own way, and as I said before, I think they managed to create a very sharp and clean brand identity in separating these two, even though the proportions are pretty much the same. So let's go in to the rear view. I think this is my favorite view of both of these cars because they both look very planted, and I love that. It's very hard to do, specifically coming out of the factory, to make a planted looking car. But I think both of these looks fantastic, specifically the chamfer that we have going on the Integra up here. I love this housing for the graphics, and I also like the taillights. It's so weird how much better this looks than the normal Integra. I think it has to do with this diffuser cutting in to the bumper and creating a much sportier rear end, and then you have these 3 bazooka tailpipes in the rear, also adding to this craziness and the sportiness of the Acura Integra Type S. You have the same type of exhaust in the Honda Civic, but they're different sizes. And again, I think this feels more wild. The Acura design just feels more wild than the Civic Type R, because the Type R looks like a pretty traditional looking integration of a diffuser. And have a look at the wings, the fins that are in the diffuser. It's a lot more aggressive in the Acura up here than it is in the Civic Type R, which has a bit of smaller fins and not as aggressive like we have in the Integra. Pretty interesting to see how they separated these two and how they managed to make the Integra Type S look more aggressive than the Civic Type R, which again, it feels like that those would be switched. One thing I love about the Civic Type R though are these graphics. I love that they dip downwards like this. So instead of having the wide body kit, this graphics with this curvature to it kind of plants the car and brings this surface down in both ends and adds to this plantedness of the rear end of the Civic. So I don't really think that this necessarily needs to have these same kind of fenders that we have on the Acura Integra. It still looks very much planted on the ground. I also like this functional air vent that we have going right here, air coming in at the front, going out right here in the back, in the front end fender, adding to the separation between the Type R and a normal Honda Civic hatchback. Last but not least, let's have a look at these two interiors. They're both very similar, but I think here is where you can see the premium feel of the Integra the most, because we have more trim pieces in the Integra from what I can see. For example, this housing of the gauge cluster is an additional trim piece going on the inside of the gauge cluster, while in the Honda Civic it's just a single piece of dash that kind of melts in to the gauge cluster. Both of these gauge clusters I think look fantastic. We have a nice housing, a little bit sharper on the Integra, as it should be, because we want to translate the outside sharpness to the interior as well. You can see we have a corner here and a corner here in the gauge cluster, while in the Type R it's just a smooth curvature going all around the gauge cluster. It feels like this integration is exactly the same in both cars, which I don't mind, and the same integration of the center console here, or the armrest area, with the manual shift, the 6-speed transmission, and the trim pieces here. Again, we have, feels like a bit of a more premium trim going around in the Integra than we have in the Honda Civic Type R down here. But these are details that I personally don't care about. I think either one of these look fantastic, and I love what Honda is doing with this one single bar of graphics going across from one end all the way to the passenger side, and then you have a couple of buttons in the middle with this texture that we have here. Looks very cool, a little bit different from the Integra up here, which has the graphics cutting right in this area, and then we have a normal passenger dash side that looks a little bit more conventional, I would say, compared to the Honda Civic Type R. Another detail where you can see the premium feel of the Acura is, if you look at the steering wheel, we have the same kind of material on the outline, but down here, this third spoke looks like it's maybe metal. I think it's metal. I doubt it's plastic, but it looks more high quality than the material that we have in the Honda Civic. Again, this is how it should be between these two brands. The Acura should always be a little bit more premium than the Honda, and I think they do a great job separating these two, both in the exterior and the interior. So, which one of these would I buy? Honestly, I would probably go with the Acura Integra Type S. I did not expect that when I first heard that they were coming in a Type S, because I wasn't a huge fan of the design of the normal or A-spec Integra, so I thought that the Type S would be still pretty weak when it comes to design. But looking all around this car, they added the exact right pieces to the Integra to make it a proper looking sports car, and I love everything about it. I love the wide fenders. All I would do is just switch out the wheels to have them fit the wheelhouses a little better, and generally just plant the car more firmly on the ground.